Hey there, Banditos. Welcome to the latest episode of the Dollar Bin Bandits, the second week of the year 2026. I'm Joe Marcello.
I'm Mike Farah.
And today we're bringing you an amazing interview. Big name comic book writer who I'm a huge fan of modern day comics. I mean, he has written some amazing work that I'm sure most people are familiar with. His work on Thor, Thanos Rising, Original Sin. Talking about none other than Jason Aaron. Love talking to Jason. I mean, his work on Thor got me kind of really back into Thor and just kept me hooked for a few years. Various titles, all running at the same time. His work on Thanos Rising was great, and all the various characters that kind of was spawned off of that. So this was, I had a really fun time talking to Jason.
I did as well. Prolific writer, amazing writer. You'll see or hear he's a little under the weather for our interview, but that did not stop him, did not stop us asking about all his bibliography. Thor was obviously a big one. I just finished the saga of Gore the God Butcher, which was just plain amazing. I can't believe I hadn't read it before now. Ghost Rider, Wolverine. Joe mentioned a bunch of others. He started out with some indie stuff, or rather original stuff like The Other Side. And now he has a couple of big projects coming out in January, February time period. One is the Bug Wars special, excuse me, that's plural. And then he has his take on Thundar the Barbarian for all you 80s kids out there like us that remember Thundar. That's going to be a special series coming out very soon. So let's get to it. This is Jason Aaron.
And today we have the absolute pleasure of talking to none other than Jason Aaron. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Doing great. We are going to kick it off the same way we do with everyone, and that is ask you how you first discovered comics.
The spinner rack, drugstore spinner rack in Jasper, Alabama. I think the oldest comic I got, that I bought as a kid was like an issue of World's Finest from 79 or 80. So, I would have been 7, 8 years old. But it's a couple more years. Like early 80s, mid 80s was where I started to go back for regular visits to the spinner rack and became addicted.
Do you still have any of those comics?
I got all of them. Yeah, they're on.
Oh, so they're all there. And the spinner
Yeah,
rack.
I got. Well, yeah, I got a couple of. I got a couple of spinner racks. I'm a 2 spinner rack household, and I actually got a third one on the way because you can never have too many. But I think this spinner rack is mostly stuff I wrote. That's like my reference spinner rack. But I've got another one that's full of the books I bought off the spinner rack.
Where do you get them? Because I'm sure a lot of us have looked for them, can't find them anywhere, and when you do, they're ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, well, this is the only one I got that's vintage, and I just bought it from my local comic shop, and it's like it's one from the 90s. It's got like, you can't see, it's got like mullet Superman on the side of it.
That's cool.
And it took me forever to figure out, it's got, slots for comics, and then it's got these other slots on the side, and I was like, they don't fit trade paperbacks. Were they for digest? And then I realized, it was the 90s. They were trading cards. So
that's pretty cool.
But the other ones I've got are like, Kickstarters that people have done over the years.
Okay. All right.
So you keep an eye out. Somebody pops up every few years and makes another spinner rack.
Nice.
That's cool business. There's really not much to them. It's like just wire.
Right. But yeah, those, like you said, those vintage ones are crazy expensive, especially, if you're trying to buy one on eBay, it's probably going to cost even more to get it shipped to you.
Yeah, someday.
So when did you start?
I got 3. I wouldn't hurt to have a 4th.
One for every.
All right.
If anybody's out there selling spinner racks, you got 3 customers right here.
Right.
Yeah.
Contact us, dollarbinbandits@gmail.com.
Apologies for me having to like blow and wipe my nose the whole hour that we talk, and that it's definitely that time of year.
It's not a problem.
I was going to say, 'tis the season. Well, so having picked up these books on the spinner rack and getting into all manner of stories and collecting at that point, when did you first start thinking about writing them, or when did you first start writing them?
I mean, I don't remember exactly the point or how old I was. I mean, it was pretty quick. I loved to draw as a kid, and then that kind of segued into me writing and drawing my own comics, and stapling them together. And at some point, very young age, I kind of left behind the drawing and stuck with the writing. And I remember, saying out loud, like to my parents, that I wanted to write comics when I grew up, but had absolutely no idea whatsoever how to even go about pursuing such a thing. It seemed like a faraway fantasy for a kid in the backwoods of Alabama, which back then, like you had to live in New York where all the publishers were, and New York seemed like that was a million miles away from where I lived. So, but yeah, I figured it out pretty quickly, and spent really my entire scholastic life through grade school and college pursuing writing in different forms. Um, and it was when I ended up winning a Marvel Comics Talent Search contest, which was now 25 years ago, 24 years ago, that I finally got my foot in the door of doing comics.
I read that that was part one of sort of a two-part process of being breaking into comics, or maybe a sort of had an echo break in where after this talent contest and getting your foot in the door at Marvel, you also started your sort of creator-owned career with the other side at Vertigo. Um, was that even from the beginning? It seems like you always had a plan, or maybe it just came together that way of kind of maintaining the balance between the mainstream and the creator own.
Well, I mean, I definitely had no sort of plan for anything. I think that was the theme of my life. The only reason I was able to succeed at breaking into comics and getting a career was just stubbornness, like the fact I loved to write, didn't really have any other marketable skills, didn't want any other. It was kind of just like it's plan A, and plan B is, I don't know, we'll figure that out when we get there. So that was the only key to my success. I think just my career in terms of the stuff I've worked on has kind of broken down to just reflect the kind of stuff that I grew up reading, and I think for me, getting into comics as a fan in the 80s, pretty great time to like be picking up comics. So it was mostly DC stuff that hooked me initially. And then, I discovered like Eclipse Comics and First Comics and Marvel's Epic imprint, and that explosion of these other small publishers and weird indie books and kind of comics of all different genres. Tim Truman's Scout and Grimjack and Jaken's American Flag, and like, so I think to me that's comics, right? Like I was reading Swamp Thing and Batman and X-Men, but I was also reading, Nexus and Usagi Yojimbo and Gru and ElfQuest, and that's still, if you look at my pull list, it still looks like that. I read a little bit of everything, and I think that's kind of what goes in and what comes out. I think in terms of the writing that I do looks similar. Like I like doing different kinds of things.
So, since Mike mentioned Vertigo, I wanted to ask. So, you did Scalped when you worked at Vertigo. Where did those ideas come from?
The
I guess
ideas
I
for
guess
Scalped.
yeah. I guess you kind of answered it, but
I mean, yeah, I did the other side at Vertigo was kind of my first. thing at Vertigo. Yeah, like you said, I kind of broke in twice, and that I won this Marvel Comics Talent Search contest, which didn't lead to anything else at all. And then there was kind of 5 years of working and writing with really nothing to show for it, and got the other side approved at Vertigo, and then Scalped kind of came right after that. And I mean, I was following kind of the best advice I've ever gotten. I think I heard James Elroy say this one time at a at a signing he was doing, of just everybody talks about like write what you know, and he said write what you like to read. And so I was just making comics that I wanted to see exist. And I loved crime stories, loved crime movies, and Scalped was kind of conceived, in part based on my love of Michael Mann's TV show Crime Story, like a weird, was it 2 or 3 seasons? I think it's three, because at the
Yeah.
end of every season they kept thinking like, well, we're not getting renewed, and they'd end on some crazy cliffhanger. The main villain's about to die in an atomic bomb blast, and then they'd have to write their way out of it the next season. Loved it, that show, how it charted. It was like that was kind of Dennis Farina's first big thing, I think, and that he was the main cop, and it's kind of following the rise of the cop as he fights to bring down this bad guy who's on the rise, this crook. And so Scalped, I thought of kind of along those terms. I was also a big fan of the movie State of Grace, excuse me, with Sean Penn and Gary Oldman, where Sean Penn, his character basically goes undercover as himself, like going back to his old neighborhood where he grew up, among the people he grew up with, who are all part of this Irish mob, and he's there undercover as himself, like trying to bring him down. So if you cram those two things together, you get the beginning of Scalped.
So the other side and Scalped, both original ideas, were they in your sort of back pocket, so to speak? Did you have like a notebook of ideas that you took them from, or did you kind of come up with them in the just sort of creative moment?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I've never. I mean, I've had ideas that stick around for years and years, but I've never really had like a. I didn't enter comics with kind of a briefcase of ideas and pitches. And the other side came from, it was another thing that was kind of important through that period of my life, strangely enough, was the Vietnam War, because my cousin Gus Hasford was a Vietnam vet and novelist, and he wrote a book called The Short Timers, which is what Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket was based on for the most part. And so Gus was a big influence on me, in that he was a guy, from my neck of the woods, who went on to make his living as a writer. He had moved off, by the time I had grown up. So I met him, I think, 3 times in my life before he died in the early '90s. Um, so after he died, I spent kind of years researching his life, and his books were all out of print, and just digging up, like old essays and short stories that he'd written and interviews, and kind of put together a website about him. And through that, met some of his fellow combat correspondents. See, Gus was a Marine combat correspondent in like '68. So I'm starting to meet those guys. Got to go to their reunion a couple of times. One of them is Dell Dye, who's maybe the most famous, Hollywood technical advisor. Like you've seen him in Saving Private Ryan and Platoon, and kind of every good war movie for about 20 years had Dale in it. So like, spending so much time learning more about my cousin, and hanging out with those dudes, I kind of wanted to do my own Vietnam War story. As a story that kind of looked at the war from both perspectives, and something that was as much a horror story as it was a war story. So yeah, that's kind of where, in some sense, even though my cousin had, been dead for like 7 years by that point, he still kind of helped me break into comics by inspiring me to do the other side and scalped. I think when the other side was kind of going well and Vertigo, my editor Will Dennis asked me to pitch some other things. I know I had three pitches. One of them was Scalped, a crime story set on a modern day Indian reservation. The other one was basically the Goddamned, like the dark Bible story book that I've done at Image. The third one was a zombie story. Um, and I think Will wasn't really interested in a zombie story, and he liked the goddamn, but strangely enough, at the time, Vertigo already had another Bible comic, so we focused on Scouts. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to your question.
No.
In short, I've kind of moved through my career. I figured out from those 5 years that I spent pitching, I think I do like what a lot of people do when they're trying to break in of like any opening you see, you pursue it, right? Like this editor acknowledged my existence in any way. What do they edit? Let me chase after that. I did that for 5 years and pitched tons of different things and had exactly nothing to show for it. And I kind of figured out after all that of like, though this is not a smart way to do it. Like I need to be strategic and let me target editors who I think are maybe who's judging by the books that they edit. I feel like our sensibilities should probably be similar. So kind of went from that just to me looking, for any opportunity or feeling like I just want to force this story through wherever I can. Like let me go find specific editors that I connect with and then go from there.
Yeah. Well, you eventually found your way back to Marvel from that initial, talent contest. Started doing books like Ghost Rider, Wolverine. Having first done your, a couple of creator-owned books and in Vertigo, how different was it? How much of a sort of shift in your brain did you have to take to sort of meet the moment at Marvel?
I mean, I don't think there was any shift. I mean, I think my time at Vertigo was me still learning how to write a comic book, I mean, other than that 10-page Wolverine story that I won the Marvel Talent Search contest for, the other side number one was my first, you know, comic book script. So, and Scalp to number one was like the third comic book script I'd ever written. So I was still figuring out how to do that. So other than that, I mean, there was not a huge transition because, I was working with Will Dennis at Vertigo. He had taken the job that was previously held by Axel Alonso, who went to Marvel. So when I came back to Marvel, I was working with Axel. So it was still, I was working with two guys who had very much, Vertigo sensibilities. And I still think of myself as a Vertigo writer.
So, when I heard that we were going to have the opportunity to interview you, I jumped at it because I absolutely love your work on Thor. Uh, it
Thanks.
got me into Thor and kept me there for a very long time. And so to start, I wanted to ask, what initially drew you to writing Thor? Was it you approaching Marvel and Marvel approaching you?
Um, I mean, I had been at Marvel for a few years at that point. I'd been exclusive for a few years. I was mostly doing X-Men stuff. I'd done Wolverine and Wolverine the X-Men and um then whatever, I don't remember exactly what year that was when I took over Thor, but that was part of Marvel Now where um some big books were changing hands and then suddenly it turned into, well, why don't all the books change hands? So literally every major book at Marvel was up for grabs. So it became, a time where just say what you wanted to do, put your name in the hat for anything because it was all up for grabs. And I had been kind of penciled in for a bit before that to take over Captain America after Ed Brubaker, which, like a pretty tough slot to follow Ed, like one of if not the best Captain America writers ever. Um, and I probably would have been my Marvel Now assignment, but I kind of realized at that moment in time I was more interested in Thor, and that really I always credit Matt Fraction for that because of um in he did those Ages of Thunder one shots or three or four of them, I forget how many he did before he kind of took over the book. I think when JMS was still writing the ongoing series, Matt did those one shots, which were very much like a heavy metal kind of vision of Thor. And that, for me, that was the first. I'd never been a huge Thor fan before. I read um, at least most of Simonson's run, which were probably the only Thor issues I'd read. I read the Dan Jurgens, John Romita Jr. stuff too. But Thor was not anywhere on my radar until Matt did those one shots, and I remember thinking at the time, reading those of like, oh, that's cool. Like I get it. I could see wanting to do something with Thor, and then lo and behold, it was like maybe 2 years later where I realized that was what was speaking to me in the moment, and I just basically raised my hand for Thor and got it, and pretty quickly it was I knew, okay, I'm writing Thor, and Esad Ribic is going to draw it, and I didn't even have a pitch yet, didn't even have a take. Um, but I think knowing that I was going to get to work with Esad, who I'd worked with a couple times already by that point, um, like I think that helped kind of shape, reinforce, the ideas I already had swirling around.
Did you get to choose what artist, or was that just kind of by chance you guys were put together
Yeah, I mean
again?
that was Axel. Like I mean, again, I think it was Esad had been doing mostly painted stuff for a while, and I think when he and I first worked together on a Wolverine one shot, which was kind of him coming back to penciling stuff again. So I think they were kind of looking for place, a big book to give him. Um, so yeah, that was Axel's idea. But yeah, I mean, there were certainly no objections from me. I was super thrilled to be working with Esad.
So you got the book. You said yes. You said without a take. Um, how did you get to, your ultimate take or guiding principles on what you wanted your Thor run to be?
I mean, I started with just sitting down and reading the Marvel masterworks of those the Stan Lee, Larry Lieber, Jack Kirby issues, which I had never read before. I'd read a lot of the Lee Kirby stuff. I'd read Fantastic Four and X-Men and a lot of the other classic Silver Age Marvel stuff, but never read a single issue of Kirby's Thor. So I started with that, really, just like sitting down from the get-go, and I think you can see so many of the major points of my, 7 years on Thor are stuff that's from those early issues in terms of, leaning into the idea of him as a god, leading into the idea of worthiness and the enchantment and his struggles with his dad and Jane Foster's place and all that. And all that stuff going big is as big and crazy and cosmic, as I think Kirby ever went at Marvel. He does in kind of the meat of that Thor run. So I think kind of became that just with a bit darker twist on it. I always talked about it as like Dark Kirby was what I was going for with that Thor God of Thunder run. And then just kind of me putting a lot of myself into that and writing about as an atheist writing about a character who is defined by his godhood, like that's what sets him apart, and wanting to lean heavily into that. I mean, I had to. Um, it was my idea to call the book Thor: God of Thunder. Like they wanted to just call it Thor because I think Iron Man was just Iron Man, and the other kind of Avengers solo books were launching just with their names, and I was like, this really needs to be Thor: God of Thunder, of just to double down at that time when the movies were kind of going in a bit different direction of like this guy is not really a god. I wanted to be make it clear like no, he is, and we're going to explore that in kind of a bigger way than maybe Thor had ever been explored. In the first issue of Thor: God of Thunder, we see him answer a prayer, which I don't believe he had ever done in his history.
So that was, going to be my one of my questions for you is kind of what do you think was missing? What did you feel need to be explored about Thor? And I mean, like you said, you really leaned into this, like the mythology of Thor and expanded on it. And I think that's like this god that is, one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel universe. He just struggles constantly. And it's kind of
Right.
like what you do with Superman. He's so powerful. How do you challenge him? Well, you got to give him something that is just equally powerful to battle with. And he doubts himself constantly and has all these internal struggles he had to deal with. And I love that aspect about what you did with him. And then, there's all the other cool like cosmic stuff that was just absolutely amazing. But what I wanted
Thanks.
to jump to was bringing in Jane as as another Thor, or as Mighty Thor. Um, when you decide to do that, were there people hemming and hawing about it, like behind the scenes, or because this is Thor, and now you want to make Thor a woman, and people are always going to be up in arms about changing their character.
No, I don't think anybody at Marvel was hemming and hawing. This was happening at the same time that Rick Remender was making Sam Wilson Cap. So, you had a few big books that were where the character at the center of it was changing. I don't think anybody knew how it was going to go over, how long it would last. Um, that certainly the reaction just to the initial announcement, before there was even a book, before a book even existed that anybody could have possibly read, when it was announced on The View of all places that,
Yeah.
Thor was going to be a woman, people lost their minds. Um, and it was for the first time I was, in a joke on Weekend Update on SNL. So just that announcement alone became massive. But I don't think, as far as I knew, nobody ever worried about it because I knew what the story was. Like I knew it was Jane. Even though we played with the mystery for a while, and I knew what her ultimate story was from the beginning to end. I kind of pitched the whole thing at one of the retreats. Um, and so I think everybody liked the story. I felt really good about it. So we knew like we were making this change in order to tell this story. It's not just let's let's change Thor um, for the sake of the surprise and the shock and figure out the story as we go. Like the story was always there.
The whole battling with cancer aspect of it really, I think, kept it grounded too. And you don't see, okay, well, now she puts down the hammer and her powers go away. Now she really has a fight. And I think that's certainly, I think anyone nowadays can relate to that because they either know someone directly or indirectly who has had a similar fight in their own life. So it was real. It was a really great story, so I enjoyed it thoroughly. So thank you for your work
Thanks.
on that.
Um,
Um,
yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think the challenge of a book like Thor or other books, like Green Lantern, books that comics that spend so much time, in the far cosmos or in other realms or away from any sort of world that we know. I think the fear always becomes, well, you're going to lose readers. They're not going to care about this because this doesn't represent their life in any way. So it's always a challenge of, well, how do you do that? And again, with Thor, I wanted to lean in and go as big and crazy as I could and explore the other realms. How do you do that with in a way that still resonates emotionally with people? And I think it helped to go back to that original Thor dynamic, which in truth, like Stan and Larry and Jack never really figured out for themselves, like when they were doing the original Donald Blake, where he's this guy who sort of a doctor with a messed up leg and who's in love with his nurse, um, and he smacks this cane on the ground and turns into Thor. Um, they seem to kind of get bored with that and sort of forget about Donald Blake and just want to spend more time flying through the cosmos with Thor, and then ultimately kind of retconned things to say, well, Donald Blake was never a real person to begin with. That was Odin kind of punishing Thor. But I think for me, like what I was doing with Jane was by far, I think of anything I've ever done at Marvel, the most like classically Silver Age, old school, superhero kind of dynamic. This is a character with a secret identity. Nobody knows that she's Thor. Um, when she's going through this horrible situation in her real life, and that she's dying of cancer. Every time she turns into Thor, it's kind of neutralizing the effects of the chemotherapy that she's going through. So when she turns back, she's worse off than she was before. But she keeps doing it because there has to be a Thor. It's got classic bits like getting back to the idea that when she throws the hammer, if it doesn't come back to her quick enough, she could change back into Jane. And then you don't want to change back into an 80-pound cancer victim in the middle of a fight against the Mangog. So that's all like classic stuff that we, for the most part, in comics have gotten away from that I had, tremendous fun and I think got tremendous like emotional weight, for the character from going back to that kind of old school stuff.
were you? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, or at least ask about it. Is how it was represented in the movie?
What's the question?
Well,
What
I
I
think
thought
the
of it?
question is, yeah, what'd you think about how it was represented?
Probably about what you think I did. The experience of it was cool, and Taika Waititi is one of my favorite directors. Jojo Rabbit, one of my favorite movies of the last several years, and he was incredibly kind and generous through that process, and loved talking story with him through all that. Loved kind of being a little bit of some more involved with than I ever had been before with any sort of Marvel project. And I sucked up every bit of, Jane Foster and Gore the God Butcher merchandise that came out. You can see it on shelves behind me. Um, Thoroughly enjoyed every part of that process. The movie I don't think is the representation of either one of those characters, and there's stories that I would have preferred. I think it was hard to kind of do justice to both of them in one movie. Um, but you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't affect the books. That me and Assad and Russell and Mike Del Mundo did. Like still in print and nice, pretty omnibus hardcovers that you can pick up from your local comic shop. So that's what's important to me. And if that helps turn more people on to Jane's story or Gore the God Butcher, that's great with me.
So you've done a lot of Marvel work, even beyond Thor, things like the Avengers, even crossovers like Original Sin. Um, what is the biggest challenge when writing within Marvel continuity, and trying to be sort of respectful of what's come beforehand, but then also obviously trying to break new grounds and take things into different directions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. That's always the challenge of how do you respect the history of these characters, which, you know, some of them, like when you're working on Superman, you're talking about a 90-year history. That's a lot of stories across a lot of different mediums. And those stories have helped make that character helped make him endure over the course of decades and make him one of the most well-known characters on the face of the planet. And he's developed this kind of devoted following, like every character has. Every killer character has their own, fervent group of fans. How do you do something that shows you understand who this character is, and you respect so many of the greats who've come before? But you're not just being slavish to that, and you're not just trying to remind people of other stories that they read in the past, or you're not just trying to ape the style of somebody who's done the book before, that you're still taking these characters forward and doing new and interesting stories so that they're going to last, for another 90 years. I think that's always the challenge. And part of that may mean, you can't respect every single panel of every comic that those characters have appeared in. There's no way to possibly make them all line up. Like you always got to kind of pick and choose. Like we're going to focus on this part of the character's history. We maybe just won't talk about this other part. Sometimes you might have to go back and change things. And I think, sometimes these days people get very up in arms. Any time that you go back and retcon, like retcon is the grossest, dirtiest word you can imagine. Like everything that has come before is sacrosanct. And like I said with Thor, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did that very early in the character's existence, and they kind of retconned the very idea of Donald Blake. So these characters always have to grow and change in some sense, and I'm always fascinated by, where you can trace how characters have changed from decade to decade to reflect the time. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any simple answer to that question, other than just do the book for you, I think you have to approach it as, look, I can't speak for every Thor fan. And like I said, I really wasn't a huge Thor fan for most of my life, but read a lot of Thor stories, found things that resonated with me, felt like I understood what was important about that character, what set him apart from other superheroes, like what were the kind of core dynamics of, to me that comes down to like his relationship with his dad. And, he's the strongest god in the universe, but he can't get his dad to respect him or love him. Like that's kind of the driving point of the character, and just that idea of worthiness and what it means to be a god. And then you put all that on the page, so you don't write a book that's just for people who've read 1,000 Thor stories and already think he's awesome. Like you have to write it for somebody who's never heard of the character, never read a single appearance. Like you have to always show your work. Like just distill down. This is what I find interesting and exciting about this character. I'm going to show you. I'm going to assume you come in with zero investment, and by the time you're done with this story, I want you to be more interested and invested in this character than you ever have been.
That's I like the way you worded that, and your way of going about working on this character. You did your homework. I think that certainly resonates with comic book readers, in that it reminds me a lot of like Jeff Johns' work on Green Lantern, making references to things that happened, you know, like 20 years ago in like a little tiny panel. It There's a little
Right.
nugget of information in there, but he brings it forward, and he did the same thing. Um,
Well,
so
I think Jeff on Green Lantern's a good example of you're right. Like he's a big continuity guy and he knows the history of the DC universe so well. But I mean, his run on Green Lantern in particular, like expanded that character's mythology to a giant degree, right? So, yeah, he's referencing tons of stuff from old comics. He's also introducing tons of new concepts, throughout his run. So I think it's always got to be some of both. Like you can't,
mhm.
even though I'd love, Walt Simonson's Thor or Garth Ennis's Punisher or Ed Brubaker's Cap, like if I'm doing any of those characters, I can't do it exactly like they did. I still got to do the book that speaks to me.
Absolutely. I'm losing my voice too. So I wanted to just jump ahead a little bit. So, what reoccurring themes like legacy and faith do you find yourself returning to in your stories, and kind of why?
Yeah, I mean, I think faith is the number one. I mean, if you go back to that first comic I ever wrote, that Marvel Comics Talent Search winning entry back in 2001, it was a story about Wolverine stepping out of the woods, finding this woman with a flat tire and having a conversation with her while he's trying to change her tire and get her out of there. Um, and they're talking about faith and kind of Wolverine's idea of faith. So from the very get-go, that was something clearly I gravitated towards, and I spent kind of 6 years exploring that with Wolverine and across different books. I sent him to hell, and I had him deal with the death and then return of Nightcrawler. Um, so yeah, I think faith is a huge one. I think familial relationships. Like I've written a lot of angry, shitty fathers, which some of his comics and popular culture in general, we have a lot of really good angry, shitty father characters. From Odin, to Darth Vader. Like I've written lots of crappy dads. Um, so that's just good drama. Um, yeah, but I mean, legacy. I mean, I think legacy is kind of a part of doing, Marvel or DC comics, mainstream comics. At this point, you kind of gotta deal with legacy in some shape or form, just because as the both those universes have such very long ones. I don't really have to do that on Absolute Superman, or I get to kind of shape and build that legacy myself. Um, but yeah, I think faith and family are two of the big ones.
Uh, you have obviously balanced, as we referenced earlier, a lot of this big, bombastic sort of mainstream comics work and, the larger companies with, your own original ideas. You've had such books like Southern Bastards, Once Upon a Time, The End of the World, Bug Wars. Uh, do you sort of take some of your energy from sort of one area and bring it to the other? In other words, did you take some of what you learned and some of what you did at your Marvel books and bring them to your creator-owned books? And do they inform each other at all?
I don't know exactly, I guess. I mean, I think everything I was doing in those early days, working on Scalped, working on Ghost Rider and Wolverine stuff at Marvel was kind of me and, grammar school. Like it was me figuring out what the hell I was doing. And I think by the time I took over Thor, I was at a bit of a different phase to where some of it was just confidence, right? Like I think um, you have to write with a certain level of confidence, even if there's no plausible reason you should have any, right? Especially when you're new. Like when I started writing Scalped, um, Karen Berger wanted to know that, like, look, if we want you to know that you have a plan. for that this could go 60 issues, but also if you don't get 60 issues, if nobody buys this, can you wrap this up in 12 or 20? And you have to kind of nod and say yes, knowing that like, well, there's no way I can do that in any sort of satisfying way. But you just kind of have to write with the confidence of if this needs 60 issues, we're going to get 60 issues. I don't think you can hedge your bets and like write it in like, well, we'll do these 5 issues and then we'll see if we get another 5, then we'll figure that out. Like I think you have to have that confidence. And that's not always easy for new creators coming in. Some of that's the responsibility of the editors or the company to give them confidence, to put them in positions to succeed. And like Ghost Rider was my first ongoing book at Marvel, and it didn't sales weren't great. It got canceled, and kind of the end of my run was a mini series that we did to tie things up. So that's one of the lowest selling books I've ever done, but that book got me other work at Marvel. So I think that confidence is really important. So I think that's the only thing maybe that I've developed or learned as I went of, I mean, being a writer, I think it's a weird mix of you have to have some level of confidence to like make this thing and then stick it in somebody's face and say, hey, you should read this thing that I wrote. But also for me, like, I grew up a very shy, awkward kid, and it was easier for me to write things than it was to like, use my words and say them out loud. So I don't think for most of my life, been a particularly confident person, in real life. But developed that confidence in just over the course of my career, I think at Marvel. So I think that helped me translating to creator own work and comics when they're working properly and and you can find some success and you can reach an audience. They're really good at that because unlike if you're trying to work in Hollywood where it's there's a lot of money on the table, but it's such a slog and a grind to kind of get things done. And a lot of people I know work out there, work for years and don't really have much to show for it. Comics can give you almost immediate gratification, and that we could come up with an idea for a comic book and know like, if we got somebody to draw this. We can make this happen. We can bring this to life, and it'll be the version of this that we want it to be. And we can get it printed, and it'll be on a comic book shelf in a matter of months. Like, once you develop that level of confidence and ability to kind of get things done, it's like a drug that it's really, really hard to walk away from.
So I want to jump from one super powerful character to another, meaning Superman.
I thought you were going to say Uncle Scrooge.
And well, that's next. That's the next one. So how do you get to write Superman, and not just any Superman? It's this new, fancy, different version of Superman that no one has seen yet. Do you? I mean, how do you get that going? Which was badass, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was like a lot of things in my career. It's just a matter of timing. It was good timing. Like I'd kind of had other points in my career where I thought about going to DC. Like I was a DC kid. I love those characters. I grew up reading DC comics. Always knew I wanted, at some point I want to write Batman. At some point I want to write Superman. But it was never the right time. And then suddenly it was like I knew my Marvel contract was coming up. I was kind of finishing all my ongoing commitments for Marvel. I realized, I think it's a good time to not be exclusive and see what else is out there and pursue other opportunities. I didn't know like anybody I knew at DC was gone by that point. There was Ben Abernathy, who was the Batman editor, was the only guy I knew there, and he's left since. So I didn't really know like it was a whole new relationship, to kind of start talking to people over there. But Scott Snyder called me one day, and I knew Scott um, just as a fan, and we had met over the years, but we'd never worked together in any capacity. But he called me and told me that, kind of his idea for doing a new DC universe didn't have a name for it yet or anything, or he mostly had thoughts on Batman and kind of how to change Batman's origin, which I thought was really exciting. And so I was really just talking to Scott. He was just looking for other people to enlist, and he and I started talking about the possibilities of the different characters and the universe overall. And even though I had just kind of walked away from doing a lot of ongoing comics and wanted to kind of take a break from that after, like 15 years of doing multiple ongoings. I wanted to kind of hop off that train. But then this opportunity, like you have to learn another important lesson as a comic creator is learning when to say no. Because early on you feel like anytime anybody asks you to do anything, this is the only time you'll ever be offered. If you say no, this will never come around. If you don't write Nightwing in this moment, if you don't write, Robin, or let alone Batman or Daredevil or whoever, like if you say no now, this will never come around again. And you have to realize, well, that I don't believe that that's not the case. Like you got to put yourself in the position to succeed and feel like if the timing's not right, maybe it'll be right later. Um, but the worst thing you can do is say yes to too many things and then not do a good job on them. Um, I'd kind of learned all that. But that said, there are some opportunities that come along that, aren't going to come around, again. And the chance to do like a brand new version of the DC universe, that's not something that happens every year. So I pretty quickly
Or
realized,
does it really?
right? Who knows? Maybe there'll be an absolute, in a
Yeah,
couple
there's
years.
going to be an absolute crisis
But
next.
in my time doing this, there haven't been a ton of those opportunities, right?
Yeah.
At Marvel in my time there were a couple different versions of the Ultimate Universe. Um, and this felt like DC doing a big version of that. So I realized pretty quickly, yeah, I can't say no to this. This is a really great opportunity. And I said I would do it, but I really, really wanted to do Superman. Um, and that was it.
Does DC, when you go to create a new version of Superman, do they tell you like certain things like, okay, well, this he needs to have XYZ, or this needs to be a part of his mythos as it pertains to this version? Or do they just give you a clean slate and you do what you want?
Yeah, I mean the whole process was really great. Again, this was all new to me. Like I was, Chris Conroy, my editor. I'd never worked with him before. I'd never met Marie Javins, the editor in chief. So this was all kind of starting from ground zero. So I'm sure if I'd come in and had a terrible pitch, they would have let me know. But no, I just walked in and was like, here it is. Here's a year. Here's a year of Superman stories. This is who this kid is. This is how Krypton is different. This is how his origin is different. His powers, everything. It was kind of all in there. Like it really kind of once I started thinking about, um, doing a new, fresh, modern take on the character that still kind of looked back to the 1930s to what he meant to Siegel and Schuster. It kind of all fell into place pretty quickly, and I put together. I hate writing pitches. That's one of my least favorite things to do. Historically, if I can get out of writing a pitch, I am happy to do so. Excuse me. This was probably the first time I was ever excited to like write a pitch to the point where I wrote a really big one, like a big Bible of like this is everything because I had so many ideas.
One of your newer projects, if not the newest project, or soon to come out, is Thundar the Barbarian. You've already mentioned, Uncle Scrooge. So you have some, sort of cartoony sort of background or experience. But Thundar is its own little kind of cult, distinct vibe, right? And I'd love to know what kind of drew you to this project and what kind of tone you're aiming to strike for this book.
I mean, what drew me to it was, Saturday mornings when I was 8 years old. Like that was my show. Thundar the Barbarian was my absolute favorite cartoon. Spider-Man and his Amazing Friends was probably second. That was kind of my introduction to the Marvel universe. But Thundar, man, I loved. Um, if you weren't around back then, if you haven't seen it, it is for the most part a sword and sorcery story. It's this guy's a barbarian. He's got a magic fiery sun sword. He's got a big monstrous kind of Chewbacca looking guy running around with him and a sorceress, and they ride around fighting wizards. But this is in the landscape is post-apocalyptic, and this is 2,000 years after a great cataclysm kind of wiped out human civilization. So you've got, kind of Planet of the Apes background. You got the ruined Statue of Liberty and old cities and the relics of old society combined with wizards and mutants and all that sort of stuff. And it's a very adventure and action driven show, which, there weren't a ton of those back in those days. So it resonated with me to a huge degree. And I had no idea at the time, as, a kid who was kind of just starting to get into comics, that there were so many comics legends who were a part of the show, and that Steve Gerber was the main brainchild. Alex Toth did the original character designs, and then he stepped away, and they're like, well, who do we get to replace Alex Toth? They brought in Jack Kirby, and Kirby did tons of work and designs on the show, and you can see so many characters in those episodes that look like they stepped out of Kirby's Thor, or, the New Gods. Um, and it's just it's just despite this strangely enough, despite that level of like comic book superstars who brought the show to life, um, it has never existed in any way in comic book form. The show lasted for 2 seasons in the early 80s. Um, and then that's it. That's the entirety of Thundar content we've ever gotten. Um, other than some Funkos and a couple action figures. So that to me is one of those jobs. Like I said, there are exceptions to the rule. Like when I was talking about how I broke into comics and I wasn't really carrying around a list of like, well, a checklist. I just want to work on Batman and I want to write Spider-Man. I didn't have that. Uh, but there's still certain characters and properties that when they come up, I'm like, yes, like the kid in me would be so furious if I said no to this. So I knew I had to do. Well, I told Nicky Barucci at Dynamite, as he was doing all these Hanna-Barbera books, I was like, well, if you get, Thundar was Ruby Spears, which is kind of under the same umbrella. I'm like, well, if you're able to get Thundar, like, give me a call. He called me probably a week later, and it's like I did it. I was like, oh, well, shit. Okay, well, I guess I'm doing Thundar. Um, and so, and you asked like what the approach to it. I mean, it's kind of strange. It was a bit surprising to me. I think as the guy who everything I've said tonight about kind of how I approached Thor and like being unafraid to kind of come in and change things where you need to, and Absolute Superman where we're changing. I've changed Superman's origin, one of the most classic, well-known stories in comic book history, and you kind of to not be afraid to do that if you feel confident in your story. As I started to write Thundar, I realized I felt more precious with this for some reason than I have anything else, and we do push things, a little bit beyond the tone and the violence and the kind of emotional scope of the of like a cartoon for children in the early 1980s, but this is not like a dark, radical reimagining of Thundar the Barbarian. I think so much of this does feel like it's channeling that show. just trying to do the biggest, craziest episode of Thundar you've ever seen, and something that, again, if I'm doing my job properly, will appeal to the people who've watched every episode of those two seasons of Thundar and know who, Mindok the Mind Menace and Gemini and the Karoks and the Man Apes and the Groundlings are, and people who don't know what the hell I'm talking about and have never heard of Thundar before. Um, like if everybody involved with the book, if we're doing our work properly, what you need will be on the pages of this comic.
Wasn't Thundar also on like an Adult Swim series or something? Or am I just remembering? I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe I mean they certainly had those that in the library. Like I don't. Maybe he popped up on an episode of
Like
Space
Space
Ghost
Ghost.
Coast to Coast or
Yeah,
something.
that
I don't know.
sounds
I think that's right. I feel
that
like there's a
sounds
satire or like a parody of Thundar on like Adult Swim or something like that, but I
There
can't.
were. I don't know how old you guys are, but like in the 80s, they would sometimes before the new season of cartoons, they would do these kind of fake, almost like award shows or variety shows where they'd kind of tease, you know, here's what's coming up in this season of Smurfs or Snorks or whatever. And and one of those they had live action versions of Thundar and Ariel and Ookla. Um, though I don't, I'm sure I watched that at the time, but I haven't gone back and watched it, and I'm sure it's terrible. Equivalent to like that Macy's Thanksgiving Day, you know,
oh yeah.
Marvel Secret Wars fight scene,
It's so bad it's good.
right? The Star Wars Holiday Special,
Oh,
Yeah,
easy,
like the
easy. That
classics
was
of our youth.
yeah, we're getting campy.
yeah, that was something special. Your career is has covered just so much amazing work. As we Superman, Thor, X-Men, Avengers, Batman. What are some things that you're working on that we can look forward to?
Well, we mentioned Superman. I'll be on that for the foreseeable future. Just wrapped up my run on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so that's I think there's one trade out of that, and there'll be another one coming out soon. Juan Ferreira, who I was working with on that, has followed me over to Absolute Superman, and he'll be working on the next arc of that. Um, I think there's one more issue of Uncle Scrooge to come out, which is kind of the one thing I've been doing at Marvel, which is a book that's hugely important to me. I mean, I really feel like I get to write Superman and Uncle Scrooge at the same time. Feels like I'm the luckiest dude in the world. Like those are literally two of the greatest characters in the history of comic books.
How does it feel to do that? I mean that's pretty damn amazing.
It's pretty cool. It's pretty
Yeah.
cool. I mean, there was a moment last year where I was doing like Batman and Conan at the same time. Um, so I've had different moments like that where I would feel like, oh, and I did an Uncle Scrooge book then when I feel like, and I don't know if anybody's ever done this before. I don't know that anybody's ever had these weeks of like, let me write a issue of Superman fighting Brainiac and then turn around and write an issue of Uncle Scrooge the next week. I think I might be the first person to do that. And I love it. Like that's kind of stuff that gets me really, really excited is doing different kind of stories and working on characters that are, mean so much to me. Um, Other than that, Bug Wars is the image book that I've got, which the first trade of that just came out. It's a big meaty trade. That was a 6 issue book one, which if you don't know, that's like my tagline is it's like Honey I Shrunk the Kids meets Game of Thrones. It's kids shrinks down, goes on an adventure in his backyard where he's the size of an insect, and he discovers there's this whole hidden kingdoms of tiny bug-sized barbarians and witches and warriors, hidden in the grass of his tiny backyard in Alabama. So it's the kind of setup that normally be a kid story, but this is the decidedly non-kid version. It's like if The Borrowers was written by Garth Ennis, like that's kind of what we're going for. So it's a pretty brutal, dark and brutal kind of um, fantasy story. Me doing like, kind of pure dark fantasy for the first time in an even bigger way than I did on Thor. That's me and Mahmoud Asrar, who, we did a bunch of Conan stuff together at Marvel a few years back. Um, and that, yeah, book one of that just came out in trade, and then we're doing more Bug Wars. It's a huge, despite it taking place in one tiny backyard, which is actually my backyard from when I was a kid, like that same kid who was watching Thundar the Barbarian, who was falling in love with the drugstore spinner rack comic books. This is the backyard he was playing in. I was, running around that yard, running through these woods, making up stories in my mind, becoming, basically doing, work related research. I just had no idea that's what I was doing. I just thought I was playing. Um, but we're doing more Bug Wars, and so in January, which is the same month Thundar #1 comes out, um, uh, the Bug Wars Spider Witch special comes out, which is um, like an oversized one shot, different stories, different creators, um, and mostly focused on the spider witches, who are kind of um, the most mysterious of the sects of mites. They live in the hanging gardens of Weird Web, which are some potted ferns hanging off the side of the house.
All right.
Very cool.
And beyond that, I can't. I don't. I think that's all I can say. I've got a couple other surprise things, but yeah, I think nothing I can talk about yet.
Well,
It's quite a
sounds
bit.
like you're just a little bit busy, which is good to
Mhm.
be,
It
I
is. I'm
think.
actually in a good place. I think everybody always assumes I'm insanely busy, and certainly have been at times, over the course of the last 20 years. But I'm actually in a pretty good place right now. Knock on wood. I don't feel like I was going to say pulling my hair out, but I don't have any hair. Pulling my beard out, like in frustration of feeling so overworked. I've got a good schedule now. Like Absolute Superman's kind of my main, work for hire ongoing book, and I'm not looking to dial up multiple of those. So I like having a little more relaxed schedule than I've had in the past, which leaves me room to kind of take interesting jobs when they pop up out of the blue.
Yeah. Well, one last question before we leave you, and just popped up out of, you going down your list of work and talking about doing, Scrooge and Superman and things like that. Do you ever get whiplash in your mind in terms of going from like one concept to a wholly different concept and tone?
No, no. I mean, I think the opposite of like that's the thing that excites me. Again, that's the kind of stuff I like to read. That's the kind of stuff I like to watch, where I like to mix it up. Even I don't like to go out and eat at the same restaurant over and over again. I'm always like, let's go somewhere different. Let's go try something new. Um, so I think that's just how I am as a consumer of story. And even I like things that kind of switch up, in the middle of the story. I love the times you can go see a movie and you can be 30 minutes in and still not really know what this is, or what the tone of it is or where it's going. That gets me really excited. So, um, and, I think I've only just started to scratch the surface. Even, 25 years into my career now, I feel like there's so many other avenues and so many other things that I still want to do within comics. Hopefully, I just saying that up until the day I die, that I kind of never run out of. I never hit the point where I'm like, well, I guess I'll go back and do more Thor now. I don't think that'll ever happen. I think I'll continue to be looking for new things to challenge myself.
And we're back. That was great. Love talking to, I love talking to everyone that we interview on this show, but it's kind of few and far between that we get to interview kind of modern era comic book writers that have just done so much. I mean, look, the work he did on Thor influenced movies, quite frankly, and you know, I'm sure that's not the first time we're gonna see his work on the screen. It was great talking to him about that work as well as, let's face it, Superman as well. Yeah, this was a great interview. Hey, and it was the first time I got a chance to do it with Mike. I haven't been able to do that in quite some time, so that was a plus.
It's always great to have more than one bandit. We get to do it so rarely nowadays, and so yeah, it was fun doing the interview with Joe. Love talking to Jason. As Joe said, he's really been influential. We always talk about the legendary masters we've had on the show, but Jason is really a modern master. And we forgot to talk about Absolute Superman. We didn't forget during the interview, but yeah, we just brought it up now. I mean, he's knocking it out of the park on that title too. So, Jason, thanks for being on the show. Joe, thanks for doing the interview with me.
Hey, my pleasure.
Exactly. And thank you out there for listening and for viewing and for everybody say it like a chorus, rating, reviewing, subscribing. Yeah, all that stuff. We appreciate your support. We got another episode coming up later this week, so we'll see you then.